I was a bit skeptical about the whole dinosaurs and pirates theme, but I think I'm finally starting to see the vision Wizards had for IXALAN. Great flavor text, by the way. But let's dive right into it. In IXALAN Limited, we have Grixis pirates, Naya dinosaurs, white-black vampires, and blue-green merfolk. But these are not actually the archetypes for IXALAN, but rather they are the sub-archetypes. So let's explain. We do have a lot of tribal synergy in the set, but the tribal payoffs don't necessarily justify building a tribal-centered deck. For example, Lookout's Dispersal costs 1 less if you control a pirate, but this tribal payoff is rather weak, and just because you run this card doesn't mean your deck needs to be pirate-oriented. And there are quite a few other cards like it where the tribal benefits are an afterthought, and these cards shouldn't force you to build around tribal. So what is IXALAN actually about? IXALAN is all about the inevitability of dinosaurs, in that sooner or later, these massive creatures will come out and dominate the board. And while there are a handful of removal cards out there to deal with dinosaurs, they are few and far between, meaning that you will run out of removal long before your opponent runs out of dinosaurs. And that brings us to IXALAN's main themes. You have the aggro decks that try to win as soon as possible, then you have the control decks that want to slow the opponent's aggression long enough to drop big creatures, and sitting between these two themes are the mid-range decks that can lean in either direction. But each archetype within these three categories has a different strategy to win. So let's go through each one, starting with the aggro-themed archetypes. And as we do, keep in mind that whether or not a deck is aggro, mid-range, or control depends largely on the mana curve. So an archetype that I call aggro can be made into a mid-range deck or a control deck depending on the cards you put in the deck. But without further ado, let's start things off with red-black aggro. This archetype will want to drop small creatures early on and then use removal to keep the board clear. And luckily, both red and black have access to quite a bit of high-quality removal. But this archetype will run into problems if it's lacking removal, as its ground creatures will find it difficult to finish off your opponent once dinosaurs come out. Next up, we have red-white aggro. Like our last archetype, this one also uses small red creatures early on and has access to good removal in both red and white. Plus, with white thrown in, this archetype can deploy creatures with a wide variety of abilities to help finish off your opponent. Our last aggro archetype is red-blue raid. Like the last two archetypes we've discussed, this one also relies heavily on red ground creatures and removal. But when the board jams, blue creatures with evasion can continue to attack to finish off your opponent. Just make sure to save red removal for your opponent's green creatures with reach. Moving on to mid-range archetypes, let's first look at red-green dinosaurs. The goal of this archetype is to drop big creatures, either by delaying your opponent with removal or using ramp. With some of the best creatures in red and green, this archetype is quite powerful once its creatures start dropping. And like the other mid-range archetypes, this archetype can lean aggro or control depending on how you build it. Next is white-black vampires. The vampires in this set are a bit on the weak side compared to dinosaurs, but it can make up for this with combat tricks, removal, and vampire synergy. But I would be hesitant to build around vampires if your pool is lacking a strong vampire lord. Next up is blue-white evasion. This archetype is a bit light on synergy, but on the upside, it will have access to the few flyers present in IXALAN. This archetype will be vulnerable to aggro ground creatures, so you will want to pick up plenty of white removal to delay your opponent. The goal is for the game to go long enough to finish your opponent off with flyers, while keeping the game short enough where big dinosaurs can't outpace you. Lastly, for the mid-range archetypes, we have green-black mid-range. I was a bit hesitant to put this archetype on the list since there really isn't a whole lot of synergy between green and black, but I suppose you could use black creatures to produce treasures, and in turn, use those treasures to ramp into big green creatures, which means black will be used to delay the game, and green will be used to finish. Now, onto the control archetypes, and we'll kick things off with blue-black control. Like green-black, this archetype uses black to delay your opponent, along with treasures for ramp. Both blue and black have access to a lot of high casting cards, and along with card advantage and evasion, this archetype should be able to turn things around in the end. The second control archetype is green-white control. This archetype has access to the biggest creatures in the set, so the longer the game goes, the better. White removal and ramp will help you get to late game. Just make sure that you have answers to your opponent's flyers. The final archetype is blue-green merfolk. This archetype is hella slow and light on removal, but the longer the game goes, the bigger your creatures will get since a lot of merfolk place 1/1 counters on your creatures. The biggest perk of this archetype is its access to unblockable creatures, and for those of you who play two-headed giant, expect these unblockable merfolk to determine a lot of matches. And there's still much more to talk about, so be sure to click on the jiggling pirate's ass to subscribe for more IXALAN content. But that's all for now. I hope you found the video helpful, and best of luck in your limited IXALAN events.